Annual forages have a fit on Montana farms. Why consider an annual species like winter wheat compared to alfalfa and other traditional perennial species? Research across an 11-year period at the Central Agricultural Research Center, CARC, near Moccasin, indicates that annual species tended to out-yield their perennial counterparts. Along the x-axis, going from left to right, fall-seeded winter cereals, spring-seeded hooded barley, intermediate wheatgrass, and dryland alfalfa. Annual species produced more than 20 tons per acre total across that 11-year period. Perennial species produced less than 15 tons. Annual species can provide an excellent seedbed after they're harvested for hay for the next crop grown in a rotation. The seedbed is particularly attractive if managed in a no-till environment. Annual species require less fertilizer when grown for hay than when grown for grain. For example, winter wheat would require typically about half to 3/4 the amount of nitrogen fertilizer as would that crop when grown for grain. When inserted into a rotation, annual species grown for forage can be used for pest management. Haying them allows for an opportunity for weed suppression, at least with some species. Growing particular annual species like oat will allow for some disease and insect suppression. For example, sawfly, which does not attack oat as it does wheat. Depending on how you manage the annual species, you can expect very good forage quality. Along the x-axis, 4 growth stages of a cereal crop: heading, kernel milky ripe, kernel soft dough, and kernel hard dough growth stages. Along the y-axis, crude protein concentration expressed as a percentage. Alfalfa at 10% bloom on average might contain about 16% crude protein. Barley, represented by the solid large green line, harvested at heading, will have a forage quality concentration approaching that of alfalfa at 10% bloom. Oat, represented by the thick, solid orange line, will have a crude protein concentration of about 14%. As harvest is delayed, quality as expressed by crude protein will decline, but yield, indicated by the dashed lines, the dashed orange oat, the dashed green barley, will tend to increase. So as a manager, you have a decision to make. Would you like to optimize quality of the annual forage that is produced? In that case, harvest it earlier. Or would you like to optimize yield? In that case, delay harvest until the soft dough stage of kernel development. Yields across the last 3 years at CARC, the Central Ag Research Center, for 2 winter wheat varieties, Willow Creek and Ray, and 2 triticale lines in a trial. On the low end, 3; on the high end, almost 4 tons of dry matter produced per acre on average. By comparison, spring planted annual species, a couple oat varieties, 2 barley varieties, an emmer variety, and a spring triticale variety. Average yields in that column along the right, as you can see, from a little over 1.5 to almost 2 tons per acre. So winter types do tend to be higher yielding than their spring counterparts among annual species. As is the case in grain production, one would expect, all things being equal, that winter wheat, when grown for forage, is going to produce more tonnage than is spring wheat. If a farmer is primarily doing spring work, growing a winter type allows for a spreading of the workload. When growing a winter type, one can expect to harvest that earlier for forage than when growing a spring type, just as is the case when growing those two types for grain. Concerns when growing annual cereals for forage: nitrate poisoning. Among the spring-seeded options, greatest concern is with oat. Oat tends to be more prone to nitrate poisoning than does barley or other spring species like wheat. Nitrate poisoning is more likely in high nitrogen environments and when the crops are exposed to stress. Prussic acid poisoning is not a real concern in cool season cereals, but it is in warm season cereals like Sudan grass, particularly sorghum and sorghum Sudan crosses. It can occur in millet species, but is much less likely than in some of these other warm season species. Let's go outside and take a look at some of the species that I have discussed.
In front of you is the winter cereal forage trial at the Central Agricultural Research Center near Moccasin. We have triticale as well as winter wheat lines in the trial. Next to me is Willow Creek. Willow Creek is a winter wheat variety, very popular annual forage in the state, the most popular annual forage grown. You can see it's a taller wheat variety. As I move back, you can see some of the experimental wheat lines that we're hoping maybe someday will be released for forage production. This in front of me is Ray winter wheat, released out of Phil Bruckner's program. Ray was released as a replacement to Willow Creek. You'll notice that Ray is quite a bit shorter than Willow Creek. Nevertheless, in trials here, Ray has tended to produce more forage than Willow Creek, and quality has been as good or better than Willow Creek. In front of you is the spring cereal forage trial at the Central Agricultural Research Center. We do have several entries of different crops in our spring cereal forage trial. This is a spring triticale line, a hooded or awnless barley experimental line in Jamie Sherman's program. Awnless barley is the most popular spring planted annual forage in Montana. Levina, Hayes are two of several varieties that can be grown. Jamie is looking at experimentals that she hopes will perform better than some of the commercially available barley lines presently grown by Montana farmers. An awnless spring wheat variety, we have a few spring wheat varieties that Westbred is testing here. Again, hoping that these will be superior performing spring planted annual forages. And oat, of course. Now, oat is not a popular annual forage in Montana, even though it tends to yield a little bit more than barley. The concern with oat is it's more prone to nitrate poisoning than is some of the other entries in the trial. Barley does perform well, and some of the leading barley varieties will produce about as much forage as oat. In terms of quality, we have found that barley quality, forage quality, tends to be as good, if not better, than oat forage.